Awesome. Thank you so much. So hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. Today, we're going to tell you a little bit about the evolution of a ransomware group from dark side to black matter to alpha. So I'm Lindsay Kaye. I'm Senior Director of the Advanced Reversing Malware Operations and Reconnaissance Group at Recorded Future. By trade, I'm a malware analyst and reverse engineer.
Hi, I'm James Niven, also with Recorded Future. I'm a principal threat researcher, and prior to threat intelligence, I was a red teamer for offensive security and CrowdStrike. So today we're going to discuss a ransomware group and how they rebrand and change throughout their entire history, whether it be from law enforcement pressure, internal fallout, or technical flaws in their lockers or malware campaign. And along the way, we'll see how they can be tracked and what they modify. Today we're going to be discussing specifically DarkSide's transition to black matter and then more currently alpha. So discovery of black matter, well, we were in the right place at the right time to kind of find them. So DarkSide had attacked Colonial Pipeline in May 6, 2021, caused a lot of problems in the U.S. Gas stations were shut down. People were trying to get gas. They had decryption issues earlier in their campaign, which you can see on the screenshot on the right. Bitdefender found a decryption flaw in their locker. So DarkSide's out of the picture for now, and there's only really one locker that has an ESXi locker available, and that's REvil. So REvil takes on most of their affiliates and most of the people associated with DarkSide at the time. So REvil had a similar downfall where they attacked a Brazilian company but has a large presence in the U.S., JBS Food Groups, and that caused a lot of attention and eventually led to their downfall as well. So with REvil and DarkSide out of the picture, there was no good Linux and ESXi locker for the ransomware community to have. So this is a screenshot from Exploit, and Exploit is one of the two primary forums where ransomware operators and malicious actors will communicate. It's primarily Russian-based. There's English speakers on there as well. And on this forum is where a lot of the negotiations of selling tools, buying things, joining programs goes, and after the forum, the initial communication on the forum, it'll go to secondary platforms such as Telegram, Jabber, Talks, and other ways that they will communicate. So, an interesting thing about this screenshot is you can see it's only one post from this actor. The way to mitigate, or way to prove you have reputation and you're actually in this game is either reputation or your Bitcoin deposit. They've got a 4 Bitcoin deposit with one post. So he's saying, I'm serious, and what he's asking for are essentially network accesses. So your initial accesses, whether it be VPNs or RDP or any slew of those. And he doesn't actually say that they are talking about ransomware or wanting you to join a ransomware group, because after the attacks we talked about previously, DarkSide's Colonial Pipeline attack, ransomware or forum administrators really kind of clamped down on the use of the word ransomware or any kind of direct association with it on the forums in fear that they would get shut down as well. So once you get into the black matter program, this is the first thing you see as an affiliate, and it essentially highlights the goods and the goods of the program. So in this screenshot, you can see they took notice from REvil, DarkSide, Lockbit, took the best features of those, improved on it. They're saying that they tested their panel for all your web vulnerabilities. They tested their decryptor, or so they think. They tested on the different versions of Windows, Linux, ESXi, NAS, later on different OSs. And it's essentially saying, this is why you chose our program. So on the left, you can see the screenshot of DarkSide's panel. And on the right is black matter. And this panel is kind of the home page for a ransomware operator. There's a lot of places you can navigate from this panel, but some of the most interesting ones are you can go talk to the victim directly. You can change prices in Bitcoin or enable Monero. You can send notes to an administrator of the ransomware group to say, I don't want to talk to this victim, or I need extra help to talk to this victim, and a multitude of other things. And the most interesting one, I think everyone's interested in the ability to build the malware itself. In the top middle screenshot, or the screenshot, you can see the ability to generate exe, ELF, PowerShell, and other builds of the ransomware. And with that, I'll hand it over to Lindsay to kind of go into the malware itself.
Awesome. Thank you, James. So at the outset of our work on this, we got access to 2 variants. So one for Windows and one targeting Linux and ESXi. You can see an example of the Windows ransom note on the top right, just to give you an idea what that looks like. So the Windows ransomware actually had several different anti-reverse engineering and anti-analysis capabilities. So nothing, wildly insurmountable, but definitely more than nothing. Comparatively, the Linux and ESXi one was substantially more straightforward to reverse engineer. So it included things like function names, which you can see a couple of examples. So those of you who do reverse engineering, this is like gold, right? So you can see all the function names, kind of what everything does, makes it extremely easy. And it contained the configuration file with a bunch of information about like configuration values of the malware in a deobfuscated format, which also much easier. So a couple of these techniques, however, actually made the malware somewhat more signaturable and easy to track, which if you're a threat researcher, this is also great. So the cryptographic routines that they use to actually encrypt the victim's files, we'll talk a little bit more about those later, but the combination was somewhat unique. The string obfuscation mechanism. So generally, ransomware will have encrypted or obfuscated strings in some way. And generally what you see is that the mechanism that they use is fairly unique to the family or variant. Black Matter was no exception. It was extremely simple. So you can see an example of this kind of first round of the string obfuscation deobfuscation function in the top right. We'll dive more into that key initialization function soon. Additionally, the function call obfuscation. So this wasn't something that I had seen before. So a normal function call you can see on the bottom. But what Black Matter did was they made static reverse engineering a little bit more complicated. So instead of just kind of doing a call directly to the address, what they did was they took a magic number, so 22065FED, and then XORed it with another value, and then would jump to that address. So when you're statically reverse engineering it, you kind of have to figure out, like, okay, where in memory is everything, which makes it a little bit slower. Dynamic, much easier. And kind of on the subject of the magic numbers, so each build had its own magic number. In this first build, it was 22065FED, and it made several different appearances throughout the code. So we released a report containing a string decryptor and some URL rules for both versions, and then magically, new versions of the ransomware started appearing, specifically the Windows ransomware. So some of them had very simple changes so that magic XOR key varied per build, and then others had very substantially more complex features. So things like new features and other changes we'll talk about. So you can see an example of that key initialization function from that first version numbered 1.2. Extremely simple. In subsequent versions, they made the string decryption substantially more complicated. So you can see an example of how that function evolved in subsequent versions. Ultimately, during the time that Black Matter was active, we never did see another Linux or ESXi build, not entirely sure why. There you go. And then ultimately, over the several months that they were active, they released 6 different versions, so numbered between 1.2 and 3.0 of their malware between July and September. So let's talk about a couple of the feature additions that we observed during these several months. So first, one of them is printing the ransom note on local printers. So other than like the entertainment factor of seeing a ransom note kind of spit out from your office's printer, one of the things that companies want to do when they get attacked by ransomware is keep it extremely quiet. So it's much harder to ignore these ransom notes coming out of printers than it is to have, somebody with, a ransom note on their screen. So this draws attention of the employees and, it's also somewhat entertaining for the actor, I'm sure. Adding the addition to encrypt additional file types. So specifically some of the Microsoft Exchange files, which we'll look at soon. So as you can imagine, attracting affiliates to the ransomware program, it's a business, right? So being able to support as many different types of file and encrypt as many things as you can, do as much damage, is something that the program wants to be able to do. Next, you can see an example of the builder on the right, so the Black Matter affiliate panel. And what this allows you to do is when you build a copy of the ransomware that you will later deploy, you can choose different configuration values. So one of the things that they added eventually was the ability to identify specific computers not to encrypt. Then, the implementation of their cryptographic algorithm did evolve over time, so how they were actually encrypting the files. And then the ability to check for large files and encrypt them differently. So when you want to encrypt everybody's stuff, you want to do it as fast as possible before the system administrators and the defenders figure out what you're doing and are able to stop it. So as you can imagine, large files take a longer time to encrypt. So what you want to do is be able to speed that up however you can. So they'll do things like, sometimes we see they'll only encrypt the first, couple of megabytes of the file, or they'll incrementally encrypt But that is definitely a feature that they did add over time. So let's look at a couple of some of these features and how they evolved over time. So on the left, what you can see is an example of the first version of their printer function. So effectively what it does is it looks for the printer on the system, and if it is not the PDF virtual printer, it'll print. So over time, starting in version 2.0 and above, they added a couple of other printers to also ignore. So other virtual printers that you may be familiar with, so Sharfx, FileXPS port, and port prompt. And one thing I want to point out is, unlike the word PDF in ASCII, you're not seeing any of those file names. So another thing that they did was they have a fairly custom kind of string hashing algorithm. So effectively what it does is it will take a hash of the printer that it's looking at and then compare it to any of those known hashes. And if it's one of those, does not print to it. So this was something that I guess it just makes reverse engineering a little bit more complicated, nothing insurmountable, but it also is something that we'll talk a little bit about other appearances of it later. So looking at the ability to add the exchange files, you can see on the left, so here's part of the function where it looks for and traverses the Microsoft Exchange file path to start finding kind of where all those files are if they are on the system. And what you might also notice is that you don't actually see the strings. You can see I've made a comment of what they actually are. But here's another appearance of that magical XOR value. So pretty simple like stack string going on and XORed with a magical value here, and then just makes reverse engineering, again, a little more complicated. Then on the right, you can see it also looking for the large file check. So it's looking for a couple different file extensions, so MDB, MDF, EDB, and ACCDB, and then it will handle the encryption of those files differently. So again, here is another appearance of that string hashing algorithm just to make it more complicated. So some researchers at NCSoft came out saying that one thing that they noticed is that previously a group called DarkSide had a fairly unique combination of encryption algorithms for encrypting files. And what they noticed is that this custom Salsa 20 matrix was something that previously they had only seen unique to DarkSide, now is making an appearance in black matter. So let's look at what this looks like. So you can see a couple screenshots of both of these. So on the top, you can see the random buffer initialization function followed by the RSA 1024 encryption that was used by DarkSide. And then on the bottom, you can see black matter's implementation of that same thing. So this is kind of what they were talking about. And then you can see how they implemented that random buffer initialization. So I guess effectively they are different in how they did it, but the salient point is the same. So that was kind of interesting. So NCSoft also found another fun and exciting feature. So remember that James had noted that DarkSide previously had decryption issues. So one of the things that they noticed is that for some versions of the black matter ransomware, there was another decryption issue here. So the issue was that victims did not have to pay for the key in order to have their files decrypted. So NCSoft in the background was reaching out to these victims, helping them decrypt their files so they don't have to pay the ransom. So after some time, this came to light, and the threat actor found out, and then they fixed that specific issue sometime around September 2021. So can't really speak to this specific issue with the cryptographic code, but you can definitely see some slight changes in the key initialization code and some of the actual crypto code itself over the different versions. So while it's not necessarily like, I guess the specific issue is the thing, it's kind of interesting to notice that it did evolve over time. So you can see a couple of different examples there. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to James to tell you about their downfall.
So as we've talked, DarkSide and now Black Matter have decryption issues with their locker. This specific chat was a large agricultural firm, and if you read the chat, I suggest you do. There's some interesting things there. There's essentially the CISA was involved in the background, NCSoft was involved in the background, other firms and everything were there. And after this, the chat kind of went downhill very fast. And there was a bunch of either security researchers, other actors, who knows who it was, but if you had the URL to this chat, you could join the chat and have fun. And fun happened. And then after this, DarkSide or Black Matter kind of shut this chat down, talked to the victim specifically, and said, here's the new URL for your chat. And then with that, the victim had to put in the domain controller names, the domain admins, and chat access codes. And we'll discuss the chat access codes in more detail later. So decryption issues, chat hijacking, losing millions of dollars by decrypting behind the scenes with the victims. Black Matter was kind of fed up. So they said, we're going to shut it down. And they claimed it was due to law enforcement pressure. And 48 hours after this post, they turned the infrastructure off and handed out the keys for affiliates to give to the victims or do the negotiations elsewhere. So it sounds like it's over for Black Matter. Not quite. One of our colleagues did an interview with a new up-and-coming group called Alpha. And in this part of the interview, you'll notice that Alpha is answering a question about the chat hijacking and also the decryption issues. So that's interesting, and it's wondering why they're talking about this thing specifically. So affiliates had moved from Black Matter to now Alpha. And we'll talk about Alpha here in a few. So if you're trying to go into the Alpha program, you essentially would reach out, as we saw earlier, that Black Matter post on exploit. You would do the same thing. And they would say, here's the rules. So here's what our locker does. Here's how much you get paid. You can get, starting out 80%. You do a lot of victims. You get 90%. And those kind of things. What our locker has, ESXi, functionality, NAS, Synology, Linux, Windows. And each one of these things, they kind of point out a group that they're saying what they did better for. And the one at the bottom right is the one that's kind of we're going to key in on. So they say hello dark side about this. And this is essentially saying that people that have access to VirusTotal can download the decryptor or download the locker as the victim posted, run it and get the ransom note and then jump into the chat and monitor it. And that's essentially how you would monitor those chats and figure out who the victim was. And that's where the access codes come into play. So a way Black Matter and Alpha kind of advertise to different people how to get into the program or the program exists is through a Jabber service on exploit. And essentially you pay a few $100s and you can have exploit broadcast this message to every single user on the server. And what this message says is we have Linux ESXi capabilities. We have a Tox ID, or talk about the specific percentages you get, and also the Jabber ID, and the thread that's kind of the recruiting thread. So once you get into the Alpha program, as you saw previously, it's a new panel. This panel will kind of highlight and regurgitate what I just said about the ESXi and the percentages. And what's new about Alpha? So with their decryption issues, they kind of said, we are really messing up somewhere, and we think it's our locker developers. So they scratched them, and they found somebody else to develop their locker. And they completely rewrote their locker in Rust. They completely redid their panel, and you can see it's very different visually. And they implemented this access code. So the way they did this was, essentially, there's an access key that's required to run beside the locker itself. The threat actor will run the locker.exe and then enter this access code. And this access code generates the correct landing page. And you'll see in the top screenshot, that's the note the victim would have. And the bottom screenshot is the one the affiliate would have so that he can enter the right code. This ransomware group also has better support, so it's quicker to talk to an admin to file bugs or just ask for help for negotiations. It has a built-in Bitcoin mixer. And it has a new feature that Lindsay's going to discuss here in a second that allows you to obfuscate your ransomware better.
Cool. So the way that Alpha Morph, the service for obfuscating your ransomware, was advertised at the outset was it helps you evade AV detection. So there really is no great AV for Linux. So I was very curious to see what exactly this entailed. And they promised a couple things. So obfuscated strings, as well as a lot of garbage code insertion. So looking at the ransomware with the morph obfuscation applied, I didn't see any actual string obfuscation, but there were a couple of interesting things that I noticed in the 64-bit morph obfuscated samples. So previously, what they had was no function names. They had removed them. But what it now seemed to have is, if you're familiar with name mangling, what appeared to be now name mangled versions of the original function names versus the unobfuscated ones with the scrub names. So you can see on the right a couple examples of what these name mangled looking function names look like. So you can very clearly see the word locker, so for the ransomware, in these. And in the x86 samples, you can see a couple of these kind of like similar, I guess, day-mangled versions of the exported variable names. So that was particularly interesting. And on the left, what you can see is what it was before the morph obfuscation happened. So not entirely sure what the point of that was, but eventually they actually abandoned this, so now they only have a Windows version. Speaking of the Windows version, so as promised, there were actually obfuscated strings now in the Windows ransomware. It was extremely simple, though. It was a random 1-byte XOR using these randomly generated functions to decode them. So you can see an example on the left of what this looked like. So you can see the obfuscated string and then the deobfuscation function. So really the only salient point of this function with the garbage code inserted is the XORing of each byte with the value 8 and the fact that it's a loop. So just gives you kind of an example of what the random garbage code insertion looks like, and we'll look at two versions compared to each other as well. So one thing was that, first of all, these Rust builds were extremely big of the ransomware. So the unobfuscated ones are about 3 megs each. Now, with the obfuscation applied, they're about 14. So over 4 times bigger. And the largest increases that we saw were in the text, data, and relocation section. So you can kind of see there what that looks like. So comparing two versions of morph obfuscated Windows ransomware, you can, as a human, very clearly see that these are the same code. What the garbage code insertion really does appear to be is a bunch of global values where they do random mathematical operations on them. Doesn't have any actual effect on how the code functions or really how anything works, but this just kind of gives you an example of what they mean by that garbage code insertion. Obviously, as a human, this doesn't really make it much harder. Not really sure how well it really also helps you evade AV in the long term.
So the story continues. The cat and mouse game has existed for years and it will continue to exist for forever. This screenshot in the top left is Krebs on Security article alluding to this specific person on GitHub being the developer of the new Rust ransomware. The screenshot on the right is FBI and CISA both release IOCs and TTPs associated with Alpha. And the most interesting one on this deck is the bottom one. So this is from Conti's blog. And what they're saying here is that Alpha and Lockbit are scammers, more or less. And what they mean by that is, as we talked about the ability for an affiliate to reach out to an administrator or someone else to handle the negotiation, they're saying that, as we saw with Revil, that the administrators would take over an affiliate's chat. So essentially, if you're the victim and you wanted to get decrypted, you could jump into this chat, say, I want to pay, but the administrators of the RAS would take that and move it to another chat. So the affiliate would not see any communication while they handled it on the side and got all the money from it. So with that, we appreciate you attending our talk, and if there's any questions, now's the time.
So we got time for a couple of questions. I know there are questions on Discord. If someone can relay them to me, that would be perfect. At least I will start with one question. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned the colonial pipeline attack or incident. And I think us in Europe are not necessarily aware of that incident, or that much aware. Would you mind just explain it a bit what happened at that time?
Yeah, so it's essentially a large pipeline it runs across America that handles all the gas. And it was brought to the news, and everybody that saw the regular everyday news they may not understand what ransomware is, but they know that their gas could be affected. So essentially everybody went to go get gas and started filling up plastic bags or whatever else to get gas because they thought that, well, it did. It kind of halted that pipeline's ability to move gas.
Do we have any? Oh, okay, I'm coming up.
Okay, thank you for your talk. What's up with them today? Are they still active?
Yeah. They're alive and thriving, as you could say.
And they didn't rebrand or anything?
Right now they're alpha.
Okay. Thank you.
Some of the affiliates from Black Matter and Dark Side, whatever they want to call them, they move. They're interspersed throughout. When Black Matter was down, some of them went to Conti or some of the more current ones. So, but the core people are still there.
Any other question? I think there might be some on Discord, I guess. Do I have them over there? I'm sorry. If someone could relay them to me in case. I don't have them right now. Okay, so we're going to be... Thank you again for coming over, and thank you for that talk.